Well, I'm very pleased to welcome Janet Treasure of the Maudsley, who's made the trek north
Yeah,
to come and see
across
us.
the river.
And she's going to tell us about families and collaborative care.
Okay, good. So I'm sort of giving a talk, part of which is what I do when we're training carers as well, because we try to give them information about why we're doing it and what's involved. So it's a mixture of both. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the historical context, and then start thinking about what models we need to think about when we're thinking of dealing with eating disorders, because in order to do a treatment, it's very useful to know what you're targeting, and so having a model is useful. Then we've got to think not only about the patient and the illness, but also the carer themselves, how they get impacted and their needs. And I'm going to be talking about interventions that help the carer, but also help the individual with the eating disorder. So we're trying to help the carer cope, and our model is that these interpersonal factors, the problems between parents and the person with the eating disorder, keeps it going. And then give you a little bit about the evidence. So Sir William Gull, who worked at Guy's, who named anorexia nervosa, did sort of say that what you have to do is immediately admit these patients to hospital to be looked after by nurses, because the parents are the worst attendants. So that was the basic model, almost the model when Paul and I started psychiatry. Not in the 18th, within the 19th century, but never mind. And this definitely was going on when Paul and I were at the Maudsley. There was this treatment study developed by Professor Gerald Russell, which was very impressive and innovative in that it was a randomized study of a psychotherapy, and people often thought you can't do randomized studies of a psychotherapy, but this one wasn't testing different sorts of psychotherapy. Well, it was, but they were so different that made it clear. One was family therapy, one was more individual. And it was held at the Maudsley, and when we were on the ward, we'd be randomising patients to have, after the period of inpatient treatment, either the family approach or the individual approach. And one thing that was very insightful with Gerald Russell was that he thought that the patient groups might differ, and so he separated the randomisation, so he'd have equal numbers in these various prognostic groups. And one group was being young, less than 3 years of illness, and with an onset below the age of 18. Another had an onset below 18, but had already had over 3 years of illness. And then the other group were adults and had developed the illness after the age of 18, with a variable length of duration of illness. There was also an additional group of bulimia nervosa. And as I said, the model was this family or individual to see if we could stop relapse after this period of inpatient care when people had got their weight up to normal levels. So the families really were being a therapist in this model, in that they were hoping to carry on with the meal support after admission. So the families are empowered to feed the child, often with saying, well, you're their parents, you know best how to do it. And this is a forest plot showing the outcomes of these different groups. And so what I want you to notice is that there's a difference with favouring the family, which differs in this group where it's the other side favouring individual. So for the early group with less than 3 years of illness, the family intervention was favoured. If they'd had the illness for over 3 years and yet had it starting below 18, it was really equivalent. There was no difference between the two. And there was a suggestion, but not significant because it crosses this line, that the later onset did better with the individual. So does that all make sense? So this was, very impressive because in each group there were only 20, there were randomised 10 to each group. So the fact that he'd separated them gave enough power to get a significant difference. But it's only on 20 patients does the family therapy work best. So it shows that this response to treatment varies with the stage of the illness. If you've got a long duration of illness, it doesn't work as much. Any ideas why that should be? Anybody have any thoughts of mechanisms or reasons, explanations? Yeah?
Go back to the sort of the longer the duration of the illness, I suppose the sort of increased apathy you get and lack of ability to understand or sympathise with other people's emotions. So if you've got family therapy, if you see your family upset or saddened, you don't understand why, and it doesn't help you because you're not like you're talking about with the mentalisation, you're not working with their emotions, you can't understand them. Whereas if you're just having to think about yourself and focus on yourself, that might be easier to do.
Yes, that's a really good answer, because one thing we do know is that social cognition really does get knocked off by poor nutrition. It's a very important part of our brain. We're social animals and takes up a lot of brain power. In fact, there's a sort of correlation between brain size and social cognition complexity. And so if you've had a starved brain for over 3 years, you lose some of those skills. And so the value of having social support is less important. And there's probably many other reasons, not just relating to the social support. The ability to learn and change is affected very much by duration of this chronic stress. Good. What's been happening recently? So this was done a long time ago when Paul and I were just baby psychiatrists. And the way we do trials, the way we involve family, the people involved, such as patients, and ask them whether it's helpful, what was less helpful, that we get this feedback from PPI, as we call it, patient public involvement. We didn't used to ask that sort of thing, whereas now it's really part of it. So there's been recent studies where carers are giving their response to this treatment, and they raise a number of problems with it. It's all very well telling us to feed the child, but what happens if it doesn't work? And we've tried doing that and it doesn't work. So there's many, and I'll go through some of those. So, as I say, this cartoon by somebody who's recovered from an illness sort of illustrate what it's like for being a parent. You've got the eating disorder in the middle, getting angry and seems to be very walled off, and you're heartbroken but trying to help. But what the parents hear is, you do your bit and feed, and then we'll do the therapy when you've got her a bit better. And sometimes it takes on a very adversarial framework, forcing the child to eat. And I think there's only now people are saying, "Ooh, be very careful. There might be violence in the family," and so encouraging the parents to take charge might not be appropriate. And there's this model. I always remember there was a case where a cat got killed, which put me off it. So And then the idea that you don't do any of the psychological work. Sometimes when these patients have had premorbid illness, autistic spectrum type symptoms, OCD, depression, social anxiety. So it sort of feels, you know, that they're being made to do something in somebody who's suffering in many other ways. Also, carers do find that there's a lot of inconsistency amongst services, not following nice guidelines. And although they might try and get help early, often there are big delays preventing them getting early treatment, or, you know, come back when your child's lower weight or something, which is very hard for them. And then we have the cases of those who are adults in adult services, and often the ethos in which some adult services are set up is that, you know, it's individual work and confidential, and we don't involve the parents. And sometimes the individual themselves will really say this, and so I don't want you to be involved, probably knowing that if the family were involved, maybe more change would happen. So it's a sort of anorexic strategy. But the hospitals may just collude with that and say, because of confidentiality, we can't speak to you. And of course that's mistaken, because there are general things that we can teach and share with carers that are not confidential. We can tell them more about the illness, we can give them skills about how to manage the illness, and so that does not involve any particular aspects of you know, the patient's problem. And indeed the government expects us to involve carers. And so these are some of the things that carers sort of highlight that are difficult for them. The fact that the sufferer's ambivalent about getting help, doesn't feel there's anything wrong. Maybe, especially after a long illness, everybody's helpless and hopeless. Often, not only does the individual cut herself off, but the whole family get cut off, you know. And often the patient will say, don't tell anybody, you know, about this, and try and soldier on their own. And they perhaps don't know anybody else with this problem. Often there's a lot of shame when your child is under your care and develops a problem. It's a natural thing to blame yourself. Parents tend to do that. And also comments from close others sort of reinforce that. And so do people say, well, why? What's it about? What's caused it? And of course that reinforces this parent responsibility. And perhaps being very unsympathetic for the course of the illness, you know, the fact that it goes on a long time, and even when people have gained weight and perhaps have left hospital, they still are very vulnerable. And the fact that that's linked to this taking a long time to get over it. You might make some physical recovery, but it takes a long time to get rid of some of the underlying psychopathology. So I mentioned before that you need to have a model, ideally, for a complex intervention, which I say eating disorders are. And so the Medical Research Council has got this framework that try and have a model, try and know what you're targeting, what are the mechanism, test it out, see if you can change it, evaluate it with RCTs. And if the model doesn't work or the treatment doesn't work very well, then you need to tweak it, tweak the model. So that's the sort of thing we've been doing. Now, there's thinking about the causation of eating disorders. That's been a bit like a historic a pendulum over time, going from more social, cultural to more biological. So it started off thinking it was misplaced values, Then there was cultural feminist theories, and now there's sort of social emotional theories. So those are the more psychological, social. In the sort of 1960s, hypothalamic theories, that there was something wrong with appetite, and metabolic theories. Then we got more interested in the brain as we had techniques to look at it, brain scans. And then we've had the big genetic studies that I probably talked to you about, didn't I, last term, where we now know that there's both brain and metabolic aspects. So these are very puzzling illnesses at the moment. They seem to be very different to psychiatric illnesses or somatic illnesses. People have various thoughts, are they physical or are they psychological? Is it body image or is it eating? Is it a neurotic illness or is it a psychotic? These, this belief in not eating to the point of death, that sounds like a delusion. And is it a developmental disorder that is there from the word go and just gets shaped, or is it just environmental factors later? And so we're answering some of these questions, and as I said, that GWAS I talked to you about last term, we know that there's metabolic factors and genes, and people are now thinking of clustering more in this social and emotional category, so writing about that. So we've developed a model that particularly for people who don't respond to family therapy, the people who've had it for a long time, over 3 years, or maybe adults. And so we've been thinking about what is it with them. So we heard that maybe everybody gets hopeless and helpless and also emotionally cut off and a lack of social cognition. I don't think you can read that, but that's the sort of thing in the top circle: fear and frustration, fragmentation of family, loneliness. And then we've got this chronic stress response, so to be chronically underweight with the HP axis being stimulated, inflammatory markers, less neurogenesis, a shrunken brain, decreased mood. So that response is important. And then there's the repeated habits. So there is a picture of a Venus flytrap. So the idea that people sort of think it's a pretty flower, but then as they land on it and then get trapped and eaten up by the illness. And this slide, again by Elise, who had a long-term illness, just showing pictorially what happens with the illness for a long time. So getting these habits and rituals, getting more and more of them. They're getting bigger over time as they're being practiced. And then, like a snowball coming down a hill, the eating disorder develops more and more problems over time, and so that's worsened. And as we said, these psychosocial changes, not only to the individual by losing her social cognition, but also the family themselves get sort of burnt out and isolated and hopeless with the illness. And I think I'd commend all of you to read this personal journey that was in the BMJ. So this was she was a psychiatrist who'd had anorexia when she was 12 or 13. And she said, if I have to describe my anorexia in one word, it's isolation. So this sort of and we know how isolation and loneliness is so toxic to well-being. And so the family offer a way to bridge connection to others, because they have a high degree of commitment, tolerance, and accessibility to break this sort of desert of ice. And we were very interested thinking about what happens to interpersonal relationships with anorexia and trying to manage the anorexia. And so I did a joint piece of work with